Pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Motion we approve the agenda.
Thank you, Randy. Second.
Second.
Thanks, James. Any discussion? All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Okay, any public comment, Mr. Blair? Okay. Anyone in here for public comment? Let's see, Jerry, speak now or during the flood part of it?
During the floodplain
Okay.
discussion would be more appropriate.
Okay, well, that'll be fine. Motion to approve our consent agenda? Okay. Uh-huh. Okay. What do you need done or modified to?
Well, which one's gonna be the matter of the permanent record? On these, the whole back pages are missing.
Well, we'll see.
Sandra, which set of minutes are you looking at, please?
I see, I think with,
It's the minutes from October the 12th.
yeah, we're missing B and C. I see what she's saying. Is that right, Sandra?
Yeah, well, if you go down through there, we've got page 1, page 3, page 5, and then it goes to page 7.
And my apologies, I copied it wrong. Here's a full set if you'd like to read them.
I pulled them up online.
So that is what the actual record is.
Okay, gotcha. So we just got a print and it just didn't print on the back. Gotcha, okay, gotcha. Okay. Anything else on that?
That's it.
Okay. With that, will somebody approve the consent agenda?
I make a motion that we approve the consent agenda.
Thank you, Sandra. Second?
Second.
Thank you, James. Any discussion, any more discussion? Nope. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Hearing none. On to our regular agenda, our floodplain management discussion item.
Mayor and Council, this item came up at your last meeting a couple weeks ago. We were talking about, at that time, the county was in the discussions about changing its floodplain ordinance, which sparked some conversation here locally. And so what we have this evening is a discussion. We've got some folks present to help answer questions. I'll go into as much detail as the board is interested in hearing. So I'll start with some basics, and that is that Mills River is not a participant in the National Flood Insurance Program. So federally backed insurance is not available to people who are purchasing flood insurance on the market. I don't know what flood insurance is available privately outside of the National Flood Insurance Program, but I do know that some folks are doing that now. In general, floodplain management, the way that it's determined by FEMA and then managed through the state is that the state will help develop the maps that FEMA approves, and then those are what are distributed to the various communities. They're updated at various times. They're supposed to be updated every 5 years, but oftentimes you'll see communities using maps that are 10 or 15 years old. I believe the maps that are effective for Mills River were adopted in 2007 or updated in 2007. So there's the floodplain, which is what you'll hear sometimes referred to as the 1% annual chance, or the floodplain, or the 100-year storm. Those are all the same term. You can use those interchangeably. I do know that folks in the regulatory world are getting away from the 100-year storm event because it's happening more frequently, and they're just calling it the 1% annual chance storm. And then you have another area of the floodplain that is mapped but is not regulated, and that is what's called the 500-year floodplain, and that is 0.2% annual chance storm, meaning there's less than a percent chance that it would happen in any given year. And then you have what's called the floodway. You might hear that referred to as the non-encroachment area, and that is the area right up against the river, was actually a little bit beyond the river channel. And that is where, when you see a flood happening out in a field, the area that's moving the fastest is typically where the floodplain would be mapped. And that's where the folks with the computer simulators have determined that on a map, that's approximate where that's going to happen. And FEMA has what they call a model ordinance, which is basically just boilerplate language that it publishes. We did something very similar with the watershed regulations last year. The state has a model ordinance, and we basically adopt that, tailor it to Mills River a little bit, and there's a couple of things you can select, like if you want to allow high density or not. But beyond that, it's basically what the model ordinance says is what's on the books. And so if the town were interested in pursuing entering the program and developing a flood damage prevention ordinance, that work is largely completed as far as the model ordinance is concerned. It's really filling in blanks. But much like the county's discussion that they just had, you would have some decisions to make about whether or not to allow floodplain fill, or to allow it only in a percentage of the property that is subject to flooding, whether or not to allow people to have the opportunity to prove through an engineering analysis that they can build in the floodplain or they can build in the floodway. So there's a few different options in front of the board. Tonight, I really was hoping we could just have more of an open discussion and help answer some questions and help educate the board. We do have Chief Livingston from the fire department here, as well as Jerry Britton, who is a longtime resident and has a professional background that I think would be worth contributing to the conversation with any historical questions you might have. So I'm going to leave it there for just a moment while I get the YouTube on Facebook, because I just got a text about that, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Y'all got any questions up to this point? So, Daniel, if we entered into this, would the town be paying money into some national flood insurance program, or is that even what we're getting into?
The
Or is it
town
more
would
of a
not,
regulatory thing?
no, the town would not be paying anything to anybody to be in the program. There would be some initial paperwork, and that I don't know if there is a fee for filing that paperwork. But once the town is in the program, there's no separate fee that would go to FEMA or to anyone. There would, of course, be staff time, which would be required for the administration of the ordinance, but no other fees.
Basically, it just allows the people in Mills River that in those areas to purchase flood insurance from the federal government.
Mm-hmm.
Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and like I said, there are a handful of companies out there that will sell flood insurance to people who are not in the National Flood Insurance Program. But from what I understand, it's very, very expensive, and there's not a lot of them out there.
Only if it's in the floodplain.
Not necessarily. You can get flood insurance on your property even if you're not in the floodplain, because FEMA considers other things than just your traditional rivers overflowing their banks as floods. If there's a water line break and it affects 2 or more properties, and there's a minimum acreage associated with that, that could be considered a flood for insurance purposes. It's not if your own water line breaks in your house and floods your basement. It's not something like that. But if it's something that, say, a public utility line in the road and your house is below the road and it floods, in certain instances that can be considered a flood event and covered through your flood insurance, because most homeowners insurance won't cover flood damage. There are other examples of it. I encourage anyone who owns a home to have flood insurance, unless you live at the very tip top of a mountain. You just never know what's going to happen. And if you're not in the floodplain, it's going to be much more affordable than if you are.
If it's all right, I'd like to get each one of these up to put their input into it and bring some light to the subject. Help us understand it a little better. Sure, that'll stimulate some more questions. Whichever one of you wants to.
I think just to help the conversation, first of all, I'll mention, Rick, you know this, but Jerry, if you come up to speak, please speak at the podium, because people watching won't be able to hear you unless you're speaking in front of the microphone. But there was some conversation recently at the county level. I think you all know Rick is on the planning board, so maybe that's a good place to start, Rick, what the county just decided to do, if that's all right with you.
First, thanks for having me. And secondly, just a little bit of history. There's probably not many in this room that are aware of this, but had it not been for Dr. Jerry Britton and a small handful of other influential leaders in this community many years ago, and Jerry will have to tell you the year, I don't remember, but had it not been for he and a few others, Mills River would be underwater right now. So, like I say, a lot of people aren't, or most people aren't aware of that, but TVA had a big plan to flood the Mills River Valley, and Jerry was he was a main cog in the wheel to get that defeated. So I just wanted to throw that out there. Excuse me. So from a planning board standpoint, a Henderson County Planning Board standpoint, we have visited this issue 3 or 4 times in recent years, and each time we've had a lot of productive discussion, and in a nutshell, each time we have voted this down to lessen the restrictions or loosen the restrictions regarding the floodway and the floodplain. That came up again recently, a month or so ago, and again we voted it down in a 5-2 vote, and it was passed on to the commissioners, and when it got to them, the vote was different. It passed by a 3-2 vote. I would say, while it's on my mind, most all of you know Bill Apsley. Bill had a 45-year career here as a civil engineer. He was, or still is, actually regarded nationwide as one of the best in the business, and he's helped, for those that aren't aware, he's helped Mills River a bunch, both the town and the fire department and everybody else. But I consider Bill an expert when it comes to these civil engineering issues. And if you haven't watched that commissioners meeting, or if you haven't, there's a summary of it in the Lightning newspaper. But if you haven't seen that or read that, please do so. There's a lot of very educational, in my opinion, information there. But in a nutshell, Bill and Rebecca voted to leave the restrictions in place that have been there for a number of years, but that didn't happen. So I'm trying to be real careful what I say here without stepping on too many toes at the county level. But it's sad, in my opinion, that we don't have more county commissioners who care enough about our county to do the right thing. I was really disappointed. I expected some of what I saw, but I did not expect all of what I saw. So I'll leave that alone. But the bottom line is, I feel like some folks are making decisions based on what's best for their pocketbook and their career and their occupation, as opposed to what's best in that case for Henderson County. I think I've never been an elected official, but if I were, I know that I would put the interests of, in this case, interests of the town of Mills River, I would put that at the forefront rather than what's best for me individually or you individually or whatever. But I feel like in Mills River that we're already kind of behind the 8 ball, because as all of you know, there's been a lot of fill in our floodplain areas. I'm not aware of any in the floodway area as of yet, but there's been a lot of fill in the floodplain areas. And you can drive down 280, and I won't mention those properties, but all of you know where they are. Obviously, that's going to impact the flow of the Mills River. And it seems like every year when we have a flooding event, and granted, some are minor floods, some are severe floods, but it seems like every time that we have a serious flooding event, that the water level rises higher in certain areas than we've ever seen before. And any of my guys at the fire department would tell you the same thing, I believe. Is it climate change? Is it construction? I don't know the answers. Personally, I think it's a combination of a whole host of things. But I can promise you that this problem is getting worse and worse. And I think I made the comment earlier when I was here, but I hope this doesn't happen during my lifetime. But we all saw what happened in Haywood County in the Crusoe community, and the same thing is going to happen at some point in Mills River. And when it does, there's going to be loss of lives, and there's going to be a lot of destruction of property. And anything that we can do to mitigate those issues or minimize the chance of it happening, to me, that's just smart business. I get probably 1 or 2 calls per month from folks in Mills River who are interested in flood insurance. And Daniel made an excellent point. Just because you don't live beside the Mills River or the French Broad or Boylston Creek or whatever, doesn't mean that you don't need flood insurance. You have, I mean, it's just, again, it's smart business to have flood insurance, no matter where you live. But I get, I could say 1 or 2 calls probably per month from folks asking, why doesn't Mills River do something? And obviously I can't answer that. To me, one of the biggest problems that we have here is misinformation, inaccurate information. A good example is recently I had a farmer that I was talking to, and he was convinced by another farmer, and I'm a farmer myself, so I can say this, but another farmer had told him that if Mills River enacted anything, that he would not be able to clean out his drainage ditches, and he would not be able to dig a ditch to install irrigation lines. Daniel, correct me if I'm wrong, but that is totally inaccurate. It's totally untrue. And there's a whole lot of that in this community. The fact that people don't understand what's being talked about here. They look at it as just an intrusion on their property rights. And yes, I'm a huge advocate for property rights and the government not being able to tell us what to do. I'm all about that. But sometimes we have to make hard decisions that are in the best interest of those around us, this being the Mills River community. So I'm not an expert on this. Jerry is, I think, knows a lot more about it probably than I do, and Daniel certainly. But I look at this as a win-win situation for everybody. If everybody understands, once again, if everybody understands what it's all about, I really don't understand why we can't do something. And Daniel, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's a lot of flexibility in how this can be set up. It's up to the 5 of you to tailor it and design it any way you see fit. It can be very restrictive, it can be very lenient, or it can be somewhere in between. But you are allowed a whole lot of flexibility in designing it however you folks want it designed. So I would just encourage you to at least take a look at it, and let's do what we can to put these untrue beliefs to rest, put it to bed, and somehow reach all of our residents in this town and let them know what the truth is. I think that would be very helpful, very beneficial. Excuse me. From a fire department standpoint, and I alluded to this a little bit earlier, but what we contend with, it is getting worse for whatever reasons, but it's absolutely positively and an increasingly worse situation than it has been in years past. So we have certain areas in our fire district or your fire district that we know we need to go to first, because those are the first ones that are gonna flood. And we hit them first. We notify folks, we encourage them to evacuate. In some cases they do, in some cases they don't. And in many cases when they don't, we've had to go back in with boats and bring them out by boat. But it's a huge problem. And yes, I'll close by saying this. Fire concerns me. It doesn't scare me, but it concerns me. But I feel like, for the most part, that I, as a fire chief, can manage fire situations. I feel like we have the upper hand in having some control with fires. But with flood events, we have really absolutely none. Flooding events, they do scare me, and they are a much greater concern to me than fires are. So, if you have any questions, I'll be happy to try to answer those, or you might have some after Jerry speaks, but I would just ask you to give it some thought and some consideration, and let's do what's best for the entire town of Mills River. And not just the town of Mills River, but those areas upstream that are not in the town of Mills River, those are also impacted very heavily by what happens here inside the town.
Jerry, you mind coming up and giving us your spiel?
I'd like to thank Councilwoman Good for inviting me. I've written a few columns in the Hendersonville Lightning touching on flood issues. And the other side of the coin, and one that I would like to advocate for, is farmland preservation. We aren't making any more of it, and when we do big landfills within the flood zone, we're losing farmland. And I think one of the founding principles of the town of Mills River was, and still is, so far as I know, to maintain rural character. And so a lot of that has to do with how the floodplain is managed and maintaining open space, hopefully. As I pointed out, most flood damage, including loss of property and life, is a result of unwise developments within the floodplain, I think. And floods are natural events. And as Rick pointed out, they're going to get more severe, evidently. A lot of climate people have written that the 100-year flood idea is obsolete because of changing world weather patterns, as we've seen in California currently. So I would urge the council to consider doing what's necessary to, within the constraints of reasonable property rights, to protect the floodplain and make it possible for future generations to enjoy these open spaces. But David Weintraub has an excellent film that some of you, I think Sandra said she had seen it, regarding the 1916 flood, and I'd urge you, if you haven't seen it, to watch it. It's been on public television, and it's a reminder of how devastating that a really, say, 500-year frequency flood can be, and with water from valley to, from mountain to mountain. So thanks for your leadership, and thanks for inviting me.
Okay, just hang tight. We'll probably have some questions. Anybody got questions for Jerry while he's up, or?
I'd like to ask some questions. I grew up here, so I've lived 60 years here, and looking out the windows at the house when it rained, the fields, they've got a lot of clay soil, and the water don't just necessarily soak down into them. And with the vegetation that's grown and the deterioration of it and come back, it's created a sponge that does help absorb water. And how long does it take to develop a sponge like we have here?
Well, I think hundreds of years, really. It's a big deal ecologically, you know.
And if they scrape that off, to do development or something like that, what's the soil gonna do then?
Well, most developments involve impermeable surfaces. So the rain runoff is faster and creates more havoc in the floodway. So, yes.
So I'm a little bit confused. So if we enacted something, I mean, and it was middle of the road, not too lenient, not too strict, and they could get flood insurance, but wouldn't that make it to where they could possibly build on it then? Am I confused in saying that?
No, you're
Okay.
absolutely right. And that has been the topic of conversation in the last
Okay.
few years that this has come up is one school of thought is because you can't get flood insurance right now, at least at an affordable rate, that you can't build in the floodplain because it would not be economical. The other side of that is because you can't get flood insurance and there's no regulations, you can still build in the floodplain. You just do it without any regulations. So flood insurance is required for any property that's developed within the floodplain, if you're in the program, and it can be lessened by doing a couple of different things. One of it is you could fill in the floodplain, which is kind of what we've been talking about, where you actually just bring in more dirt and you fill it, and rather than being at ground level, your house is now 5 or 10 or 15 feet above the lowest adjacent grade. Or we don't see it much in Mills River, but you can see it in some of the mountain communities. You can build a house on stilts, and so that when it does flood, the water is allowed to come up and doesn't cause any damage, and then it goes back into its banks. So I think the sentiment has been, let's not enter the program, so that way insurance is not available for people, and therefore we won't get development. And I think so far that's worked pretty well. But the thing that I always caution elected boards with is it may have worked well up to this point, and it might work for a few more years, but as development continues to occur, the easy land, the land that's not in the floodplain and it's flat, is going to be built up, or hopefully it's preserved through a farmland preservation program. But if it's not, and it's developed on, then people might start looking at those more flood susceptible areas, and that's what we don't want. But that is, I think, the reality of where we are in relation to the interstate and to Asheville and Hendersonville, and we're a very desirable community. And unless something significant changes, development will continue to occur over time. There is a little bit of protection with regard to watershed regulations, but that really just limits the actual building itself. But you could still fill in the floodplain even if it's in the watershed, just as long as you're not putting too much impervious surface on it.
Has the watershed restrictions gotten easier since they first implemented them, or are we still following the same standard? Does anybody know? It seemed like when I pulled permits back in the late 80s, early 90s out here, it was a lot tighter. I mean, they looked at it a lot harder, a lot more strict than even they did before they brought it over here. When Toby and them was still doing it, it had eased up tremendously on what you had to prove to them.
I don't know the answer to that question.
Okay.
We've only been doing it for a few years, and
I don't know the answer to it either, but I've heard a lot of different cases.
Yeah.
That's exactly what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
But apparently,
Yeah.
I,
Because like right now, if someone come in here for a zoning permit and up toward my house, up 280, how far what is the uppermost line of anything that you need to look at? And see if, let's just see if it's where it used to be. Because it used to be right there about where they built Southern Concrete. It's right because they wouldn't have been, something about not being able to have that inside the watershed at one time. They wouldn't, that's why they ended up there as far as it did. They didn't want it way up there. They wanted it more back down this way, but they wouldn't want to put it in because of the concrete plant. Let's see where it's at now.
Yeah,
Because
so
they're
you got-
right on the line.
You're just talking about the boundary,
Huh?
like the
Yeah.
southernmost boundary of the watershed
Yeah,
area.
We got, yeah, critical, and then it steps out to what, 3 steps or 4?
Yeah, so watershed district 4, which again is because of the Asheville plant and everything flowing to the French Broad, that goes to, I think you're about right, a little past Gash Road to the Maple Hill Mobile Home Park.
Yeah,
That's
it's
about the
right there.
line. Now, obviously, everything upstream of the Hendersonville plant, that's where you get the critical area and the more restrictive regulations.
Yes. Let's see, wait. Okay. Am I right in thinking that we've almost got a natural dam in Mills River at the Fanning Bridge Road, coming down by the experimental station, and then the hill that Sierra Nevada sits on? It seems like that's always dammed up there and has to go through that bridge. And then I often wondered years ago if the state didn't build that road to protect everything on down. Because in a big flood event, as kids, we'd go over there and it would have, and I don't know what it's going to do now because a lot of that's filled. But you know, that used to be all flooded. And then forcing it through the bridge, and you go to the other side and look over toward the experimental station, it was running fast, but it wasn't spread out because it was just now purging through.
What I'm telling you is hearsay. I
Mhm.
don't know this for a fact, but I've been told by a lot of folks that have been around a lot longer than me, and I've seen pictures of it, but the road that you're talking about there at the research station used to be a whole lot lower than it is now.
Mhm.
And folks have told me that because Butler Bridge Road is impassable during a serious flooding event, that they felt like there needed to be some corridor somewhere for folks to get from Fletcher to Mills River and vice versa. So that was, again, I'm just telling you what I've heard through the years, but that's one of the reasons that I've heard is that they raised the level of that road so that would allow people to go back and forth and not be stranded on one side or the other.
Yeah.
But I worked over there for 31 years and I've seen it a lot, but you're absolutely right. That is almost a dam, right?
Yeah, okay.
And
Why-
obviously that all that does is cause us a whole lot of problems.
It
back
backs
up
it
this
up,
way.
backs it
Right.
up, yeah.
Right.
While you're right there, you, Daniel, Jerry, would this, if we entered into something like this, not knowing what our restrictions, would we need to look out for farmers trying to restore their banks where like the Mills River comes in a curve and it bursts through? Would they be able to put that back? That's going to be something that's going to get brought up, I'm sure.
I guess Daniel would be more of an expert on this than me, but from what I have read and from what I have been told, it does not tie the hands of the farmers.
Okay.
And again, with me being a farmer, the last thing I want to do is enact something that's going to be detrimental to the farming community. You know, farmers have enough challenges as it is, and we don't need to make things harder on them. But if we can do something that's a win-win for everybody, then, you know, why not? That's the way I look at it.
Okay.
And Jerry mentioned this when he was up here, but in the county 2045 comprehensive plan, one of the biggest things that we heard in all of our community meetings was, please preserve farmland. Please do what you can do to keep agriculture in Henderson County and keep it thriving and productive and profitable. So, like Jerry said earlier, every time that we fill the floodplain areas, it's no secret what you're filling is farmland. I mean, take a look in Mills River. Everything that's been filled used to be farmland. So, I made this comment to my board with the county, but if we're truly interested in preserving farmland, then let's do it. Let's quit talking about it and let's put some teeth in it and make something happen that's actually going to preserve farmland. But
Is this the only way we can? Like, could we do something that said, we're not gonna enter into this? This is more, but you can't flood or fill in the floodplain in town of Mills River.
I don't know.
I'd defer to Daniel for the floodplain regulations, but I was just looking up some of the approvals for the townhomes and for Pardee because there was quite a bit of fill placed there. I think it was mostly in the 500-year floodplain, but I think the long short of it is it's unregulated. So I looked through and they just needed a sediment erosion control permit from the state. So when they put the fill, it didn't leave the site. That was it.
To answer your question, I don't see why you couldn't have a standalone floodplain protection ordinance and not be part of the NFIP. I don't know of anywhere that does that, but it seems to me like it's no different than any other natural resource preservation or protection type of land ordinance, and we have those already. But I would confirm that with the attorney before I would give you a definitive answer on it.
And do you know definitively if you could or could not exclude agriculture? Like,
If we're in a national flood insurance program, agriculture is largely exempt from the regulations, but it couldn't be outright excluded.
couldn't write it, you know, if we were tailoring it to Mills River, we couldn't put that in there.
No, because the model ordinance has basic minimums is what it would do. And agriculture, things like putting in new irrigation lines, clearing out ditches, plowing fields, I mean, all that stuff is exempt. But where farmers might get sort of caught up in the mix is if they were doing something along the riverbank. Like cleaning out a riverbank is one thing, but if you're in there and actually rerouting the riverbank, then you would have to go through this engineering analysis, and this is what the county was kind of just talking about, where you would hire an engineer and they would model it in its current condition and then in its proposed condition, and if they can verify what's called a no rise, meaning that the work that's being completed is not going to create any kind of rise in the base flood elevation, then it would be an approvable project. And that's a minimum that is in the federal language that we would either have to allow people to apply for that no rise certification or just prohibit it outright. But you can't not you can't loosen it up so that you don't have to do no rise, I guess is what I'm getting at.
So you could have the no rise in there, and then that would inadvertently make it to where you couldn't fill in the floodplain.
No, not that you couldn't fill in the floodplain. It means if you're in the floodway and you're doing something that could impact the channel of the river, or you want to fill in the floodway, you would need to get that no rise certification completed. But again, the floodway is the area nearest the river that highest velocity is most dangerous.
Daniel, am I right in saying there's just a minimal amount of municipalities that doesn't participate in this in North Carolina? Is that right?
That's right. There's about 27 communities that don't participate in the state, and there's over 600 when you combine cities and counties. Whether those are counties or municipalities, I couldn't tell you off the top of my head. I just know that there's 27 don't participate.
So, help us out, guys. Why have we not been participating in the past? What's been the biggest stickler to it? What's been the big turnoff up till now?
I think, in my opinion, again, I've only got 4 years of history with the town, but what I've heard is agriculture and people getting inadvertently caught up in having to permit things that they wouldn't otherwise have to be permitting, or wouldn't be able to do things that they would otherwise be able to do. But then, I think it was your point that you mentioned earlier about by not having flood insurance available, people can't build there. And if you allow insurance to be purchased there, then you're sort of inviting development into the floodplain.
Okay.
So my experience has been that the town has always wanted to just stay out of it and let common sense prevail, which one of your employees telling me that's what's happening.
All it, lot is in the name, I think, and call it floodplain zoning, that's one thing, call it farmland preservation, I think community would embrace it.
But I'm confused because this, if we approve this, just blanket what it is, we can sell flood insurance to the next 5 different townhomes down through here. Easier than now.
They would be able to purchase flood insurance through an organization that is supported by the National Flood Insurance Program.
But you see what I'm saying? It's like a little bit both. It's like we should do this to prevent it, but it's allowing it to be easier.
That's
Right.
That's one of my concerns also, James. But on the flip side of that, they can fill the floodplain in the town of Mill River. Bring it up out of the floodplain, correct, Daniel? And they wouldn't need your flood insurance at that point. They feel secure in not having it. So I
Is-
understand a lot about what's being said here. I do. Go ahead, Sandra, because I've
No.
got some questions.
What I was gonna say is there any way that we could maybe look at no fill on
Floodplain.
the floodplain?
Yeah, so just to take a little bit of a step back on the flood damage prevention ordinance, the model ordinance that I keep talking about, it assumes the floodplain is going to be filled. Like that is allowed, just in the boilerplate language, and that is up to the floodway, not the whole thing, but from the floodway to where the floodwaters aren't going to be anymore. It assumes that's going to be filled in. So if the town wanted to be more restrictive, it certainly could say that the model ordinance allows everything, but we're going to restrict it to only 80% of your property, or 75, or 20%, or whatever comfortable, or whatever number the town was comfortable with. You certainly could do that.
Well, if you've lived here for more than 2 years, you know it's gonna flood. I mean, it does it all the time. Just not to the extent that it could or has before.
Right.
Randy, read your questions off to us. See. Well, we talked about some of them, and I wanted to ask Daniel. So, you said that the landowner might have to get a permit or something if we were in this program that they wouldn't have to get a permit for that. So, can you give me an example?
Sure. So under the FEMA regulations, development, as it's defined in the flood ordinance or in the federal regulations, is you going out there with a shovel and scooping over and turning over a shovel full of dirt. That's development. So they want everything permitted. Now that doesn't mean you have to have standards for it, nor does it mean you even have to charge a fee for it. But if you do have a farm and you are going to be building a ditch, I won't use a farm because there's some agricultural exemptions that I'm just not 100% familiar with. If you're a homeowner and you are putting in a pool in your backyard, well, pools are going to be at grade, obviously, so you're not filling it in necessarily, but you are disturbing the floodplain, so you would get a permit for that. In most communities, they charge like a $25 fee just for the processing fee, and they fill that out. The floodplain administrator, whoever it is, signs it, puts it in a file, and then and move on.
So it don't get sent to the feds or nothing. It just stays on hand here.
It doesn't get sent anywhere, but we would be audited. So
Okay.
the National Flood Insurance Program does its own regulation through the state of North Carolina. So the state would come in at some point, once we're all set up, and they would look through our files. These typically happen every 5 years, but again, they're not exactly 5 years. And they will look at floodplain development permits, just to make sure that you're issuing the permits according to your own ordinance, because you have to follow your own ordinance. The other one that we haven't talked about are things called elevation certificates. So if you're placing a mobile home in the floodplain, your surveyor would fill out what's called an elevation certificate, and that is where they, as a professional surveyor, go out there and capture the lowest adjacent grade, whatever elevation that is, the finished floor elevation, the lowest horizontal member of the structure, wherever your utilities are connected, and that has to be filled out to the T. And I've been through an audit before, and they will look for every checkbox and everything that needs to be filled out. So you don't send it anywhere unless you're trying to change something. Otherwise, it just stays in the file cabinet in perpetuity in town hall or storage unit or wherever it goes.
Okay, so I get your example about the swimming pool
Mhm.
residential. So, but most of the flood areas in Town Mills River are agriculture.
Mhm.
So give me an example, or maybe a couple of examples
Mhm.
of the difference, of what they would not have to get a permit for
Mhm.
now,
Mhm.
and if we were in this program, what they would have to get a
Okay.
permit for.
So using an ag facility as an example, if you are agriculture user and you want to build a building in the floodplain for storage or whatever the case may be, right now you don't need a permit for that. Don't need a zoning permit, don't need a floodplain permit. You just go and do it. If you want to build that building in the towns in the floodplain program, you would get that permit for it to notify the town that you're doing it. That's the minimum that you would have to do. Now, if you wanted to put electricity in it, I don't know if Duke does this already, but they might already require that the meter be above base flood elevation. But if they don't, it would have to be set at above base flood elevation. And if you wanted to put in like an HVAC system or something like that, the actual unit would have to be above base flood elevation. So you might have a building sitting on the ground, but your unit would be a couple feet off the ground, so it's above the floodplain elevation. So that's an example where right now you don't need a permit for any of that stuff from the town, but you would have to get a permit for that if we were in the program. And then I'll use the irrigation ditch digging as an example. If you're putting in a new irrigation line, technically you're in there digging up the floodplain. It would be considered development. But if everything's going right back to the way it was, there'd be no additional permitting. It'd just be, I'm disturbing the floodplain signature in the file.
So what about, I'll touch on something else in just a minute. If there was a landowner here in Mills River and they owned on one side of the river, and maybe they don't like their property flooding so much, so they kind of over time built up a berm on that side of the river. Is that allowed now?
It is now.
And it would not be allowed if we were in this program? Or
No.
you would have to permit?
You'd have to permit it, yes. And if you're just in the floodplain and there's no restrictions on fill in the floodplain, that permit is all you would have to do. And it would be like very similar to a zoning permit, just like a site plan where I'm filling my boundaries, those sorts of things. Now, if you're right up against the river and you're in the floodway, you would have to get that permitted, and you would also have to do that no rise certification to prove that you're not creating a rise. But as long as you're not creating a rise, you can put whatever.
So let's touch on that rise thing for a minute. So I think I understand it, but so if I own property in the floodplain and I want to develop that property without being on stilts or something like that, and I want to bring that property up out of the floodplain, so I hire all the dump trucks, fill it in. Do I have to, at that point, get a surveyor or an engineer to come and give me a certificate that says that that property is out of the floodplain?
If you want to avoid having,
because of the no rise thing. Do I have to,
no,
now, do I have to, get some sort of certificate from somebody, I don't know who,
mhm.
that says I'm not making the river rise on my neighbor's property because I filled in this property?
If you go with the model ordinance and your filling is outside the floodway, there's no certification from anybody that you would have to get. Now, if your purpose for elevating was to be out of the floodplain for insurance purposes, then you would need to hire that engineer to fill out that elevation certificate. That's not something that the town would be involved in from a regulatory standpoint.
Right.
It would be you filling out, your surveyor fills it out, we get a copy of it.
Okay, now give me an example of what a development or somebody that was filling in the floodplain would have to get the no rise certificate for.
Sure. So let's use the town's property back here behind our walking trail. A lot of that's in the floodway because it's right up against the river. And if the town had it in its mind, it wanted to build a baseball field back there, and we needed to fill it all in, 20 feet of fill to keep it out of the flooding, we would have to hire an engineer, and we'd have to have a civil engineer design a set of plans for us, a set of plans with fill that we would give to that hydraulic engineer and say, Mr. Engineer, can we do this and not create a rise in the base flood elevation? And he would run it through a formula in a computer program, and if the answer to that is 0.0 feet rise, then we're solid. But if there is a rise in the floodplain, and FEMA measures it in tenths of a foot, which is 1.2 inches. If there's a rise of a tenth of a foot or more, then you either can't do the project, or you have to modify the flood maps, which typically would require consent from both property owners, because you'd be impacting your neighbor at that point.
Okay. So if Mill River entered this program, and I think the county allows you to fill 20%
Mm-hmm.
in the floodplain, is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
And Mill River, just pull a number out of the air, Mill River entered this program and then put the restriction on that you could only fill 50% in the floodplain.
Mm-hmm.
Is that possible?
Mm-hmm. It is.
But on the flip side of that, that kind of devalues someone's land
Mhm.
also too, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can certainly look at it from that perspective as well.
Because if you're only allowing them, whereas now they can fill 100% of their floodplain,
Mm-hmm.
it's worth $50,000 an acre.
Right.
And if we're only allowing them to fill half of that land,
Mm-hmm.
then that's devaluing half the property.
Yeah,
Correct.
I think that's a logical conclusion.
Okay. So I'm just thinking out loud a little bit too, so. And the other question I had was, it was probably for Shannon, since Shannon, you were on council for a long time before. And did this ever come up in the past? And if it did, why, or was there a lot of opposition from just a couple of council members?
Pretty much. It was, Sue might can remember it better than I, but we've discussed it in the past before, but it was just briefly. We never got into any meeting of this nature, I don't think.
I'm pretty sure we did when you were not on council.
Okay,
This has come up 3 or 4 times
okay,
in the last 20 years.
okay,
And Daniel pretty much nailed all the reasons. There were
okay,
too many concerns for it to go very far.
okay.
I have one other question.
Sure.
If the town enters into this program and I own even part of my property's in the floodplain, do I have to get the flood insurance?
Very likely you wouldn't need to. The way that it varies by lender, but if you own your property outright and there's no mortgage or anything, you don't need flood insurance. If you own that property and there's a structure on it and the structure is out of the floodplain, it depends upon your lender. Some people will require you to have flood insurance even though your structure's not in it, but your property has some, they might require you to get it. I've seen other ones that as long as your structure's out of the floodplain, but your property might be in, they don't make you get flood insurance. So it's dependent upon your lender. and your ownership situation.
Anything else? Any more questions? Okay. Y'all thought anything else that y'all would like to bring to our attention after hearing our question? I would say that the way I've been trying to sell the farmland preservation is I've been trying to tell them that I'd like to see the town of Mills River have enough land set aside to at least feed the citizens of Mills River. And I don't know how many acres it would take, but, 50, 100 years from now, if we had 200 acres set aside that we knew that we could grow enough stuff on to feed the citizens of Mills River, I think that'd be awesome. Raise some cattle, raise some produce, tons and tons of potatoes that we knew the citizens of Mills River could make it through to the next summer. And that would be some more of a feat. It wouldn't necessarily have to be used for that, but it would be almost like banking oil in the ground. We would have it set aside as farmland preservation land, that it could be farmed however you wanted it, but at some point in time, if a crisis ever happened, we would have that to back up on. People would have to get off the couch and help a little, but we could make it happen with all this. You would think we could still make it happen and survive here. That would be a great feat, I would think. A great feat.
Can I get one more question?
Absolutely.
More for Chief Livingston. From the county's perspective, the county is in this program, correct?
Yes.
Yes. But what they just did was loosen the requirement.
Okay, that's what was going to be my question was,
Loosen the restriction.
you can change it. It's not like what you settle on day one is forever written in stone. You can modify it
Absolutely.
either way.
Sure.
Okay, that was my question.
The FEMA has minimums, correct, Dana?
That's right.
And you can't go below the
Correct.
FEMA minimum.
But from what I'm understanding, Henderson County was stricter and has now loosened it.
Correct.
That's correct.
They've loosened it to what FEMA allows them to loosen it to.
Mm-hmm. Yes, but yes,
They were more restricted.
correct. Than the minimum of this.
Mm-hmm.
Y'all talked about it a minute ago, but the county has allowed up to 20% food previous. But none of that could be in the floodway right beside the stream. But now what they're allowing with permitting process, approval process, if they got that approval, they would also be allowed to build in the floodway right beside the stream, in addition to the 20% floodplain. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And,
Am I right?
Yeah, you're right. Mm-hmm.
and the
That's right.
floodway, whenever you look on the GIS, is the diagonal lines along the river.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at that here in Mills River, if they did that up next to our floodway, what would the results be?
Mills River runs extremely fast during flooding already. I mean,
Right.
it's gonna take it away, you would think.
That, I'm glad you brought that up because I tried to point this out, or I did point this out to the county planning board. And I might have even mentioned it when I was here the other night, but let's just take Prince Broad River, look at it for a second. And right behind us here, it's not uncommon for that river to be spread out for a quarter of a mile, 4, 5, 6, 7, 800 yards wide in some cases both sides. In other cases only on one side. But when that happens, when it's allowed to spread out like that, what you're doing is you're so when we fill the floodplain areas, what that does is it pushes that water closer to the floodway. And what Shannon said about Mills River is true. That's a relatively fast flowing stream compared to the French Broad. And the higher the velocity of the water, the faster the flow of the water, the more destruction it's going to do to anything around it, be it stream banks, homes, buildings, whatever. Those of you, and I'm sure I saw the last serious flooding event that we had in Mills River, there were agricultural fields that were destroyed that have never ever been destroyed in the past. That proves my point that I tried to make earlier about this problem's getting worse.
I know one thing I saw with the last flooding event we had here that was bad was a log jam down here on Hooper Lane Bridge that was unbelievable. It was up even with the bridge and went back, how many feet would you say?
At least 100 feet.
At least 100 feet. And there was rubber boots, backpack sprayers. I mean, they could have easily been people in there. And the water was still running through it.
Glad you mentioned that, Sandra, and I've got pictures of it if anybody didn't see it. But the reason for that is because that water level got higher than it's ever been before, and it was taking out trees and stumps and cars, Lord knows what. But it was taking out debris that has never been affected before. So every bit of that junk was, like you said, it was just piling up against the roof. But like I say, the reason for that was that water level was above what we've ever seen.
Anything else?
I've had a lot of good information. Thank y'all.
So, Daniel, where do we need to go from here? I mean, what's our next step? Seek more information to make sure we got clarity, or?
It's really up to the board. I mean, I think this is a good conversation to have, at least on an annual basis, because there are some other things that we as a town should consider that, you know, the everyday homeowner wouldn't need to. And there's a list of things that the North Carolina Emergency Management Office puts out that says something to the effect of impacts of non-participation in the NFIP. And one example, Randy and I talked about this the other day, and the example was given for a mudslide and not being able to secure insurance for that. And that's actually something that the National Flood Insurance Program covers. I didn't realize that. I had to look that up this week. But the thing that has always kind of piqued my interest from the town perspective is we permit development every day. When it comes in the door, meets the standards, we issue a permit, it goes out the door, and they go build. And because we've been fortunate enough that common sense has prevailed for a long time, people don't really build in the floodplain all that much, but they do on occasion, and they will continue to over time as land becomes more scarce. And if we as an organization, as a town, are aware of that development, and through the eyes of the federal government, we're not trying to regulate it or stop it or anything like that, there is a possibility that someone could come back to the town and said, well, you knew this was going to happen, but yet you let me do it. And people can be sued for anything nowadays, it seems. So that is something I like to just mention every so often, is that there is potentially some liability there by not doing anything to prevent or slow down development in the floodplain.
I can understand the need of needing flood insurance in case of a disaster, because I've been told in conversations that if we don't offer flood insurance and we have a disaster, then FEMA can't come in to help. And I wish there would be some way that we could figure out how to offer flood insurance without opening a door to create destruction to the floodplain
Mm-hmm.
that holds the water when we need it to. And I
Yeah.
don't know what that is.
Well, I think just to be clear for those who might be watching and listening, is it's not that I don't think FEMA wouldn't come in to assist, but if the town ever sought disaster funding, like if you know there was a big issue and we've helped pay for a bridge replacement or something to that effect, by not being in the program, we wouldn't be able to get reimbursed for those expenditures.
Oh.
But I think FEMA would certainly still come in and assist in case of an emergency, like they do anywhere. And that's an interesting point you raised. I don't know if having a flood damage prevention ordinance that doesn't meet FEMA standards would allow people to purchase flood insurance or not. It might be worth a conversation with someone who works on insurance, really, to come in and shed some light on that for us. I'm just familiar with the National Flood Insurance Program.
So Daniel, and since you're the administrator for the town,
Mm-hmm.
and I'll ask, either you or Michael can answer this for me. I guess first off, would you like to see the town of Mills River in this program?
I would.
You would?
Mm-hmm.
So, saying that, what would it look like? Would you just go with what the FEMA minimums are? If you had your choice, would you just say, this is what it's going to be, whatever the FEMA minimums are, and we're just going to go with that? Or would you add to it restricting the percent of fill in the floodplain? Or give
Yeah, I see what you're asking.
me what you're thinking.
I think the model ordinance is very gracious in what it allows. I would be satisfied if the town was in the program with the minimum standards, I guess, to answer your question, frankly. I would be supportive if the town wanted to restrict fill in the floodplain to a certain percentage of the property. But I also would worry about the private property rights associated with that, because that's a very real thing. I live in a community that doesn't have zoning, and that's not an accident, So I respect that. So I would be comfortable if the town was in the program and applied only the minimum standards. But I certainly wouldn't oppose tighter standards either.
And if I could just add to that, and I'm not a resident of the town, as you know, but got a ton of friends that are. A lot of them talk to me about this, but I think almost all of them that I have talked to, or that have talked to me about it, they would be happy with your proposal. They don't overly restrictive stuff, but one of the things that they're looking at, a lot of friends in Haywood County, and in emergency management over there too, and they have told me on several occasions that if it weren't for the federal, and they got millions and millions of dollars in federal assistance for the Crusoe community, but they've told me several times that if it weren't for that federal money that they got for assistance, there's no way they could have survived that event or rebuilt their infrastructure that was destroyed there. So just having that, and if we just had the minimum, at least we would have that available to us. A serious event, just something to think about.
Yes, I still haven't convinced myself that if we're in this program, that it's not going to make it easier for people to obtain flood insurance and put more development pressure on their floodplain. I can't convince myself of that yet. I mean, I'm still open to talking and thinking about it, but on the other side of that, I can't really stomach the thought of restricting the amount of fill somebody can fill the floodplain because of what it's gonna devalue the property. So it's, yeah, we just got some things to think about.
So why don't we put this back up on another agenda when we don't have a loaded agenda? Jeff will be back. Jeff's gonna have a bunch of good input on this, I'm sure. And let's come back to this in the near future. Let's don't just put this off a year. Let's put this off maybe a month or two.
I agree.
When you see an opening like tonight where we got plenty of time to just sit here and get through it again. This is gonna stimulate some others, I'm sure, to come forward with their, it may be landowners that want no restrictions, or it might be somebody that's like, I'm right here. If they feel this, I'm in trouble. Next big one. I'd like to hear from those people also. So we'll get out and beat the bushes and tell them this is gonna be coming up on another agenda, and let's get some more community input would be great on this one.
Yeah, I think before we do anything about putting pen to paper for an ordinance, I mean, I think another discussion with Jeff in the room was a great idea.
Yeah.
But after that, if there's serious consideration of developing something, before we do anything about pen on paper, we push information out to the public and say the town is considering doing this.
Right.
Have meetings here, have meetings at community centers. Because even though it sounds simple,
this one ain't simple.
it's not simple, and there's a lot of little quirks to it. Like if you're gonna put a mobile home and you have a propane tank, you gotta have the tank anchored, you know, and things like that people should know before the town makes a decision about clearing the program or not.
I would like to at least have a hard copy of what the minimums are.
Yeah.
From FEMA, please, if you could do that.
Yeah, I was about to ask that. Would we get like a generic something?
Yeah. Just, I'm sure it's pretty easy. We
Yeah,
probably
I've
get it
got a
online.
copy of the 2021 non-coastal model ordinance, so I can print that and send it to you.
Yeah, and I agree with you, Shannon. It should be sooner rather than later.
Yeah.
Continue this conversation.
And Jerry, in the meantime, be thinking about how we might be able to implement some of that farmland preservation, even if it's in a different strategy. You know, we may put this in play for this, but
Good model up in Montgomery County, Maryland. You might want to look it up. They've got a website. That has their farming. They've been able to protect 90-some thousand acres by compensating landowners through creating easements.
okay.
So take a look at that as a model. Not entirely fit Mills River, but it'd be a starting place.
Okay. Daniel, I don't want to get totally off subject here, and we could bring this up at council comments or whatever, but the Golden Leaf money, the ag money, is there any way to secure any of that grant-wise for this land preservation?
I don't know.
I just thought about that this week. I said, you know, they might be something there we could tap on. It's farming money, tobacco money.
So, just touching on that, we're really close to bringing what we've got together with our farmland preservation to the council.
Okay.
Daniel, I think you said our meeting in November.
That's right.
Good.
Our first meeting in November.
Good.
He'll be saying.
Good. So, I'm still working at the county level, try to get them to help us on board too.
Good.
Yeah, we are. Okay. All right, moving on. We'll go to B, Harris County more for the Forge Mountain Cell Tower.
So in front of you this evening is a draft of a memorandum of understanding that would be between the town of Mills River and Henderson County for the improvements of the Forge Mountain Radio Tower. The town budgeted money in the last fiscal year to help with this project, and as we were nearing the end of the fiscal year, I wanted to go ahead and get that money off the books for the year, so we provided it to the county. They've not utilized that money yet, and I asked for them to develop an agreement that both parties can sign, just to ensure that that's what the money is going towards, and if there's any money left over, the town will be reimbursed its share of that money. So this was drafted by the county attorney, reviewed by the town's attorney, and she had a couple corrections that we've included. So I'm presenting it to you this evening with a recommendation to approve it and authorize the mayor to go ahead and sign it.
And that was the 50,000 came from ARPA funds, correct? Or was it?
We did not end up using ARPA funds
We
for
didn't.
Mm-mm.
appropriation of fund balance.
Yeah.
Did they say what the holdup was on installing the tower? I mean, 6, 8 months ago, it was, getting a contractor to commit to doing the job and the parts also, I think.
As far as I know, they are dealing with the FCC and FAA right now. Mike, do you have any other updates you can share, or that's the sum of it?
It's a long permitting process.
Okay.
That I receive things occasionally, but they are going through it. Yeah.
It said in here that it's going to help the law enforcement and fire protection services. Is it going to help residents up there have better cell phone reception too?
It should, because the replacement tower will be taller, so they can have, usually they have 3 different height spots where cellular providers can co-locate. I think they have one provider already picked out. But yes, as cell providers locate on the tower, and the height will be much better, service should be better out there. I think the current tower is a little bit below 100 feet, and the last time I talked to Mr. Brissy with the county, he said even with the trees growing up, the signal's just not able to get down into the valleys very well back there. So with the new height, and then again the the co-location of providers, it should be better.
From adjustments or anything?
No, so I went through the cell tower ordinance, and you only need a special use permit if it's above 250 feet. And it's not a new tower, it's a replacement, so it's basically just a zoning permit administrative approval.
This main tower is basically for, emergency, use, and the additional space, I'm assuming will be rented out for the cell phone provider.
No, that's what I read.
Okay, so we're probably needing a motion, and I read down here, we can approve, the memorandum of understanding, deny the request, request modifications, or take no action. So I will entertain a motion for any and all of those.
I make a motion that we enter into the memorandum of understanding with the county and authorize the mayor to sign.
Thank you, Randy. Second.
I'll second it.
Thank you, Sandra. Any more discussion on this? Hearing none, all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Hearing none. Okay. When y'all get caught up, we'll move on with our staff updates. Town clerk will be first.
I really ought to do something about moving me down. Just FYI, at your next meeting, I'll be presenting 2 petitions for annexation for 2 parcels on Ray Hill Road. One is completely contiguous and one is just off. It's adjacent to it, so we'll do one and then the other. It's all at council's discretion.
Okay.
I'll present the information, and if you choose for it to go forward, then there are several steps we go through.
So a voluntary annexation,
Absolutely
Okay.
voluntary.
all right. Okay. Is that all you have? Okay. Lynn, Michael? Good. Now,
Before I share updates, I want to introduce Michelle Simpson to the group. Michelle is our Parks and Recreation Coordinator and responsible for the wonderful party we had Tuesday evening. So thank you, Michelle, for all that work. And I'm going to yield the floor to you if you have any updates to provide.
I know you've been busy, you've had some, stuff going on, but how is the fishing tackle? How's that going? Anybody borrowed any, rented any, taking any?
We haven't started that program yet. We are waiting on North Carolina Wildlife Commission to come in and, help us do a kickoff day.
Gotcha.
And so I'm waiting on them to tell me when they can come and help us do that because we don't really have a lot of staff.
Okay.
We want to do a big kickoff day for that, so just waiting on them. Also been talking with them about trying to get the river stocked,
Yeah.
but unfortunately I hit a roadblock with that, unless we purchase fish ourselves. So the hatchery, on the Davidson River is being renovated, because of the last flood, I believe, whenever that was, looking at that time. So that put a lot of, pressure on the other hatcheries. And so I think it is smooth, because we talked about it, we're very confident in this. But unfortunately, the hatchery will not be renovated for another 2 to 3 years. So we're gonna have to figure out other means of possibly getting the river stocked. There's not very much fish, in that river. So, and I'm also, waiting on the Rotary Club is gonna be putting in a lime garden for us. So once the lime garden is put in, then, we get North Carolina Wildlife Commission to then help us do like a big kickoff day. That's when we're gonna do that.
Sounds good. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Anything else?
The only thing I wanted to add was I've already mentioned this to you individually, but Senate Bill 68 was approved this week. So if you are interested in running for council, either our current members or anyone in the public listening, the filing period has been moved from July of 24 to this December. So it's going to be synced up with all of the other elections that are going to be on the ballot as far as filing periods go. So it's December 4th at noon. It runs through December the 15th at noon. So again, that is just about 6 weeks away. I just want to remind council and the public of that change. That's all.
And that affects Mills River's 2 seats this time, correct?
That's right.
Yeah.
There are 2 at-large seats available,
Okay.
currently held by Mr. Austin and Mr. Young.
Okay. All right. Any council comments tonight? Everybody good? All right. I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Thank you, Randy. Second.
Second.
Thank you, James. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Right.